In the year 1842, beneath the suffocating heat of the American South, slavery was not only an economic system, it was a theater of cruelty where the bodies of enslaved women were the primary stage. Vast plantations spread across the land like monuments to stolen labor, their quiet beauty hiding a daily choreography of suffering. For enslaved women, each sunrise meant exposure to a world where pain was expected, silence was enforced, and survival required a strength few were ever meant to carry alone. These women lived under constant surveillance, their lives governed by bells, whips, and the unpredictable tempers of those who claimed ownership over them. They were forced to labor while pregnant, punished while grieving, and violated without recourse or protection. The law did not recognize their pain, and religion was often twisted to justify their torment. In this world, cruelty was not accidental. It was intentional, systematic, and refined over generations. This story is not about a single plantation or one nameless woman. It is about a pattern of torture inflicted upon countless enslaved women whose suffering has been minimized, sanitized, or erased. To tell this story is to step into a truth so brutal that it forces an uncomfortable question. For many enslaved women, was death kinder than the life they were forced to endure? From the moment an enslaved girl could stand upright, her body was no longer her own. It was inspected, catalogued, and evaluated like livestock, judged not by innocence or potential, but by how much labor and profit it could eventually produce. Childhood vanished quickly under the weight of expectation. Puberty did not bring womanhood, it brought danger. A developing body marked her for exploitation, punishment, and control, all justified by a system that denied her humanity. Violence was administered with ritual precision. Whippings were common, but for women, they carried a particular cruelty meant to shame as much as to wound. They were often stripped before being beaten, their nakedness used as an additional weapon. The crack of the whip tore through skin and air alike, leaving scars that never fully healed. Overseers watched without emotion, counting lashes while blood soaked into soil already darkened by generations of suffering. Yet the most devastating torture was not always visible. Enslaved women lived under constant sexual threat, knowing their bodies were considered accessible by those in power. Assault was routine, resistance was punished, and pregnancy often meant deeper bondage rather than protection. Children born from violence were reminders that even their wombs were not safe. Every scar, every birth, every night lived in fear reinforced the truth. Slavery turned living into an ongoing act of torture, one that many endured only because dying was not yet permitted. The tools used to torture enslaved women were ordinary objects transformed into instruments of terror. Whips braided with metal, wooden paddles soaked in salt water, iron shackles that bit into flesh. Each was designed not merely to punish, but to prolong suffering. Pain was calibrated. Overseers learned how to cut skin without killing, how to break muscle without ending labor, how to leave a woman alive enough to work, but wounded enough to obey. Torture was not chaos. It was method. Women were often punished differently than men, their pain shaped by a cruel obsession with control and reproduction. Pregnant women were whipped while suspended over shallow pits, forced to lie face down with holes dug beneath their stomachs so the unborn child would survive while the mother absorbed the lashes. The goal was clear: protect the investment, not the woman. Her screams were treated as background noise, her agony an acceptable cost of maintaining order. Even rest was weaponized. Enslaved women were forced to stand for hours, arms raised, bodies shaking until collapse. Some were locked in cramped sheds or wooden boxes, barely large enough to breathe, left in darkness for days. These punishments were meant to erase time itself, to disorient the mind until submission felt like relief. Survival required dissociation, faith, or something harder to name. Every breath taken under these conditions was an act of defiance against a system that perfected suffering. Torture was rarely hidden. On many plantations, it was performed, deliberately in public spaces, turning suffering into a warning etched into memory. Enslaved women were forced into yards, fields, or clearing grounds where others were made to watch. Children stood frozen beside elders, learning early what defiance cost. The intention was not only to punish the body, but to colonize the mind, to make fear contagious, to ensure obedience spread faster than hope. Each scream was meant to echo long after the sound faded, settling into the nervous systems of everyone who heard it. For enslaved women, public punishment carried a distinct humiliation. Their clothes were torn or removed, exposing them to leering eyes, while their dignity was systematically dismantled. Overseers and owners treated these moments as demonstrations of authority, sometimes inviting guests to witness discipline as proof of control. Laughter was not uncommon, neither was indifference. The crowd was forced to absorb the lesson. A woman's pain was permissible, her body a stage upon which white dominance could be rehearsed and reaffirmed. The violence did not end when the whipping stopped. It lived on in the memory of being seen, powerless. Yet even within this forced spectacle, something dangerous to the system sometimes emerged. Witnesses remembered. Women locked eyes with one another across the crowd, exchanging silent recognition that said, "I see you, I know this pain." These moments were small and fragile, but they mattered. They carried a truth the system tried desperately to erase, that the women enduring torture were not objects, not warnings, not property, but human beings whose suffering was witnessed, remembered, and quietly carried forward as testimony against the lie of slavery itself. For enslaved women, torture did not always arrive with whips or chains. Often it came quietly, at night, without witnesses, without record, without consequence. Sexual violence was not an exception to slavery. It was one of its central mechanisms. Enslaved women lived under the constant knowledge that their bodies were considered legally available to those who owned them. There was no crime in the violation of a woman who was defined as property. The law did not name it as rape. History rarely named it at all, but the fear of it shaped every breath they took. This terror was deliberate and strategic. Sexual violence was used to assert dominance, to remind women that even their most intimate boundaries did not exist. Resistance invited retaliation, harsher labor, physical punishment, or the sale of children to distant plantations. Many women endured in silence, not because they lacked courage, but because speaking carried unbearable costs. Their pain was compounded by isolation, by the knowledge that there would be no justice, no acknowledgement, no protection, only repetition. Pregnancy, instead of offering respite, often deepened the cruelty. Women were forced to carry children conceived through violence, then returned to labor within days of giving birth. Their bodies became sites of both trauma and profit, their wombs treated as tools of expansion for the system that tormented them. To survive such violations required a psychological endurance almost impossible to imagine. For many enslaved women, the absence of death was not mercy. It was the continuation of a sentence designed to break the soul while keeping the body alive. For enslaved women, motherhood existed under constant threat, its tenderness poisoned by fear. Children were born into bondage, their first cries echoing in cabins where hope and dread lived side by side. A mother could nurture, sing, and pray, but she could never promise safety. At any moment, her child could be taken, sold, or used as leverage to enforce obedience. This uncertainty was not incidental. It was engineered. Slaveholders understood that controlling a woman's children was the most efficient way to control her spirit. Punishment often came through the womb. Women who resisted were threatened with the sale of their children, sometimes forced to watch as they were led away. Infants were ripped from arms still warm from birth. Toddlers dragged toward wagons while their mothers screamed until their voices collapsed into silence. The sound of a child calling for their mother was a weapon used repeatedly, carving wounds no whip could reach. The system relied on this devastation, knowing that a woman, shattered by grief, was easier to command than one fueled by hope. Yet even here, enslaved women resisted in the quietest ways. They memorized their children's faces, their voices, the way they smelled after sleep, storing these memories as sacred possessions no one could steal. Some taught their children to remember their names in case they were separated. Others whispered prayers into small ears, planting seeds of identity where the world insisted there was none. Motherhood under. Slavery was a prolonged act of mourning, but also an act of defiance, insisting on love in a world designed to erase it. Beyond the lash and the violation, enslaved women were tortured through deprivation so constant it became invisible. Hunger was not accidental, it was regulated. Rations were calculated to keep a woman barely alive, never strong enough to resist, never weak enough to die. Cornmeal, rancid pork, and occasional scraps were expected to fuel bodies forced to labor from darkness to darkness. For pregnant women and nursing mothers, this starvation was especially cruel. They were asked to produce life while being denied sustenance, their bodies slowly hollowed out by exhaustion that no sleep could repair. Work itself became a form of prolonged torment. Enslaved women bent their backs in fields until muscles tore and joints swelled, then returned at night to cook, clean, and care for children in cramped cabins, thick with heat and smoke. Illness was treated as inconvenience, not emergency. Fever, infection, and injury were ignored unless they threatened productivity. Many women worked through miscarriages, through open wounds, through sickness that would have confined others to bed. Rest was framed as laziness, pain as disobedience. This form of torture was quiet, efficient, and devastating. It erased women slowly year by year until their bodies carried the weight of decades in a single generation. Faces aged early, spines curved, eyes dulled, not from lack of intelligence, but from relentless fatigue. Death came not with drama, but with collapse in a field or silence in a cabin. And even then, the system recorded only loss of labor, never the extinguishing of a life that had been starved into submission. The most enduring wounds inflicted upon enslaved women were often invisible, carved not into flesh, but into the mind. Psychological torture was woven seamlessly into daily life, so constant it was rarely named. Women were denied autonomy over even the smallest choices: when to sleep, when to eat, when to speak. Their names were replaced with ones chosen by owners, severing identity from ancestry. They were called girl, regardless of age, a deliberate shrinking meant to erase authority, maturity, and selfhood. Over time, this erosion of identity became its own form of captivity. Enslaved women were forced to witness violence against others as a warning tailored for the soul. They watched husbands beaten, children punished, elders humiliated, knowing intervention would bring suffering upon themselves. Silence became a survival skill. Emotions were carefully rationed, hope tightly guarded. To feel too much was dangerous. To feel nothing was safer. This emotional numbing was not weakness. It was adaptation. A mind learned to fracture itself in order to endure what the body could not escape. Yet even in this landscape of deliberate psychological ruin, enslaved women found ways to resist erasure. They told stories at night in whispers, sang songs layered with double meanings, passed down knowledge disguised as folklore. Memory itself became rebellion. Each remembered ancestor, each preserved tradition, each prayer spoken in secret defied the system's attempt to reduce them to silence. The torture aimed to make them forget who they were, but remembering became a quiet, sacred act of survival. Enslaved women were not only exploited for labor and reproduction, they were also used as living test subjects in the name of so-called medical progress. Doctors seeking fame, recognition, or innovation treated enslaved women as expendable bodies, operating on them without anesthesia, consent, or regard for survival. Pain was dismissed as exaggeration. Screams were interpreted as resistance rather than suffering. These women were restrained, cut open, and stitched back together repeatedly, their agony justified by a belief that black women felt pain differently, or not at all. Gynecological experimentation was especially brutal. Enslaved women suffering from injuries caused by childbirth, rape, or forced labor were subjected to invasive surgeries performed again and again, often in front of audiences of students. Recovery was irrelevant. Infection was common. common. Death was acceptable. What mattered was data, reputation, and the advancement of white medical authority. The women themselves were rarely named in records. Reduced to numbers or descriptions, their suffering erased even as it was exploited. This form of torture carried a particular cruelty because it was disguised as care. Hands that claimed to heal instead inflicted deeper wounds. Trust was impossible. Even illness became dangerous, as seeking treatment could mean becoming a subject of experimentation rather than a patient. For enslaved women, the very institutions meant to preserve life became extensions of the system that tortured them. Their bodies advanced a science that denied their humanity, a legacy that still echoes through medical mistrust generations later. For enslaved women, survival itself was often treated as a crime. Any attempt to protect their bodies, their children, or their dignity could be reinterpreted as rebellion. A woman who refused sexual advances, who slowed her pace in the field due to illness, or who spoke back in defense of her child, risked severe retaliation. Punishment was not always immediate. Sometimes it was delayed, calculated, delivered when the woman least expected it. This unpredictability was intentional. It trained the mind to remain in constant anticipation of pain, never allowing peace to settle. Women who attempted escape were punished with particular cruelty. When caught, they were often branded, shackled, or confined in iron collars lined with spikes to prevent rest. Some were placed in stocks for days, exposed to the elements, insects crawling freely across wounded skin. Others were sold south as punishment, torn from familiar faces and any fragile sense of community they had built. The message was clear. Survival beyond submission would cost everything. Yet even under these conditions, enslaved women continued to choose life when the system demanded their erasure. They hid food for their children, learned secret paths through woods and swamps, feigned illness to protect others, and endured pain so their families might endure. Another day. Each act of survival invited punishment, but it also affirmed something the system could never fully destroy: the refusal to surrender one's humanity, even when that refusal was met with torture. When every structure of power was designed to break them, many enslaved women turned inward, clinging to faith not as escape, but as armor. Prayer was whispered in fields, hummed beneath breath while working, pressed into the dirt at night when bodies finally collapsed. Faith did not erase pain, but it gave suffering meaning beyond the cruelty imposed upon them. In a world that insisted they were less than human, belief affirmed that they were seen by something greater than their captors. This spiritual grounding became a quiet rebellion, dangerous precisely because it could not be whipped out of them. Yet even faith was targeted. Enslavers mocked prayer, punished gatherings, and manipulated scripture to enforce obedience. Women were told that endurance was godly, that suffering was their divine role, that silence pleased heaven. These distortions cut deeply, forcing enslaved women to wrestle with belief itself. Many learned to separate God from those who claimed to speak for him, crafting a theology born not of pulpits but of pain. Their faith became intimate, raw, shaped by tears rather than sermons. In moments of extreme torture, some women prayed not for release, but for strength to endure another hour, another night, another breath. Others prayed for death, believing it the only door left untouched by cruelty. And still many survived, carrying faith scarred but unbroken. That faith traveled forward through generations, braided into songs, stories, and traditions. It stood as proof that even when the body was violated, the spirit could remain unconquered. There came moments when pain stretched so long and so deep that death began to feel like relief rather than loss. For many enslaved women, the line between living and surviving blurred until existence itself became unbearable. Torture that never ended, violations without consequence, children stolen, bodies exhausted beyond repair. These realities pressed the mind toward thoughts that were never spoken aloud. Some women prayed quietly for death, not out of weakness, but because life under bondage had become an unbroken corridor of suffering with no visible door. Death hovered constantly at the edges of plantation life. Women collapsed in fields and were left where they fell. Others succumbed to infection after untreated injuries or invasive medical abuse. Some took their own lives in rivers, swamps, or cabins, choosing an end they could control when everything else had been stolen. These deaths were rarely recorded as tragedies. They were written off as losses of property, disruptions of labor, inconveniences to profit. The humanity behind them vanished the moment breath stopped. And yet, even in death, enslaved women resisted erasure. Their passing left absences that could not be filled. Children who remembered a voice, a touch, a song hummed in the dark. Communities remembered them in whispered stories, in names passed down, in grief carried quietly across generations. If slavery was determined to make life a prolonged torture, then remembering those who did not survive became an act of reverence. Death may have ended their suffering, but memory refused to let their lives be reduced to silence. What ultimately survived was not the whips, the chains, or the systems that perfected cruelty. It was the women themselves, carried forward through memory. Enslaved women left no monuments carved in stone, but they shaped history through endurance that refused to vanish. Their suffering did not disappear when slavery ended. It echoed through daughters and granddaughters, through inherited caution, inherited strength, inherited faith. The nation moved on quickly. They did not have that luxury. Survival became legacy and memory became responsibility. The truth of their torture was deliberately buried, softened by language, hidden behind euphemisms like discipline and custom. But silence never fully won. Stories passed quietly at kitchen tables, in church pews, in warnings given to young girls about a world that still did not protect them. These women were not only victims of history, they were its witnesses. Their pain became evidence, their endurance became indictment. To remember them honestly is to confront the foundation of a nation built on their suffering. Today, their legacy demands more than acknowledgement. It demands truth without comfort. To say their torture was worse than death is not exaggeration, it is testimony. They lived where mercy was denied, where survival required unimaginable strength. And still, they loved, believed, protected, and endured. What survived the torture was not just their bodies, but their humanity, passed down like a quiet fire that refuses to go out.